November 1977, Paso Robles, California. A man named Gerald Mack walks into a pawn shop on Spring Street with a small velvet box in his coat pocket. He is 31 years old. He sets the box on the glass counter. He opens it. Inside is a bronze Star with Valor device. The citation ribbon is still attached. The man behind the counter looks at it. He looks at Gerald. He says, $40. Gerald looks at the medal for a long time. Then he says, "All right." 3 feet behind him, a man in a work jacket is looking at a rack of old hunting rifles. He has not moved in 2 minutes. He is not looking at the rifles anymore. Here is the story. Gerald Mack was born in Paso Robles in 1946. His father worked the vineyards south of town. His mother took in ironing. He was the second of 4 children. He was not a remarkable student. He was not a remarkable athlete. What he was, from the time he was old enough to follow his father around the property lines of the vineyards at harvest, was reliable. The kind of boy who finishes what he starts. The kind of boy who does not need to be told twice. He graduated from Paso Robles High School in the spring of 1964. He did not have the money for college. He did not have a plan beyond the fall. He was 19 years old when his draft notice came in January of 1966. He reported as ordered. He was processed at Fort Ord and shipped to Fort Benning and shipped from Fort Benning to Tan Son Nhut Air Base outside Saigon in the spring of 1966. He served 2 tours with the 25th Infantry Division. He came home in the spring of 1968. He was 22 years old. He had a bronze Star with Valor device in a velvet box and a hearing problem in his left ear, and a way of sitting in rooms with his back to the wall that his mother noticed before he had been home a week. She did not mention it. She fed him. She let him sleep. She let him find his own way back to whatever came next. What came next was 9 years of trying to make the math work in a town where the vineyards hired seasonal labor and the packing houses paid by the hour, and a man with 2 tours of Vietnam and no college degree and a bad left ear was not the first person anyone called. He had a wife named Sandra. He had married her the summer he came home, quickly, the way men marry when they have come back from somewhere they do not want to go back to and want something solid to hold. Sandra was a good woman. She had waited. She had written letters every week for 2 years. She had kept a photograph of him on the dresser and told everyone who asked that he was coming home, and she knew it. She was right. He came home. They married. They had a son in 1970 and a daughter in 1972. They rented a small house on the east side of Paso Robles with a yard the boy could run in. Gerald worked whatever work came. The packing house for 3 years, a lumber yard for 2, a gas station on the highway for 1.5 years until the owner sold it to a chain and the chain brought in its own people. By the fall of 1977, he was doing day labor at a construction site north of town and coming home with dust in his boots and $12 in his pocket, and a tiredness that was not the tiredness of a man who had worked hard, but the tiredness of a man who could not see the end of the row. The hearing aid the VA had fitted him for cost $48 a year to maintain. The left ear had gotten worse. He had missed things at work. He had missed a foreman's instruction on a Thursday, and it had cost him 2 days of pay. He had $40.11 in the checking account. Sandra did not know. He had not told her. He had been carrying it the way men carry things when they do not know how to set them down. The velvet box had been on the shelf in the bedroom closet since 1968. He had not opened it in 4 years. He opened it on a Tuesday morning after Sandra took the children to school. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a while. He thought about the morning they had given it to him. He thought about what had happened on the morning that made them give it to him, And he put that thought somewhere else quickly, the way he had learned to do, the way a man learns to move a thought to a room in the back and close the door. He put the box in his coat pocket. He drove to Spring Street. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The pawn shop on Spring Street was owned by a man named Howard Dills, who had run it for 22 years and knew what he was looking at when a man put a military medal on his counter. He had seen 3 bronze stars in his career. He had seen 2 Purple Hearts. He had seen 1 Navy Cross, though that man had come back the next day and taken it home, and Howard had been glad. Howard was not a cruel man. He was a businessman. The business was not kindness. The business was margin. He looked at Gerald Mack's medal. He looked at Gerald Mack. He said $40. He said it the way a man says a price he already knows is wrong, but is the price his business requires. The man in the work jacket at the rifle rack did not move. He was standing with one hand resting on the top rail of the rack, and his head turned slightly, and his eyes on the glass counter 15 feet away. He was not a large man. He was lean and long, and had the look of a man who had spent a great deal of time outdoors without making anything of it. He was wearing a canvas work jacket the color of old wheat and a plain wool cap pulled low, and he had not shaved in several days. He had come into Howard Dills's shop 20 minutes earlier looking for a particular model of bolt-action rifle he had been told Howard occasionally stocked. He had not found it. He had been about to leave when Gerald Mack came through the door. He had watched Gerald set the box on the counter. He had watched Gerald open it. He had seen Howard look at it. He had heard Howard say $40. He had not moved since. He was listening to something he had not planned to hear, and it was doing something to him that he could see no way around. The man was Clint Eastwood. He was 47 years old. He was between pictures. He had driven up from Carmel on a Tuesday because he wanted to look at rifles, and he did not want to drive to Monterey to do it, and he had heard Howard Dills knew his inventory. He had not told anyone where he was going. He had not brought anyone with him. He was standing in a pawn shop in Paso Robles in a wool cap and a canvas jacket, and he was 3 feet behind a man who was selling a bronze star for $40 because his VA hearing aid needed maintenance, and he had $12 in a checking account and could not tell his wife. Eastwood did not know any of this. He knew only what he had seen and heard. He knew the velvet box and the citation ribbon and the number 40, and the way Gerald Mack had looked at the medal before he said, "All right." That was enough. That was the whole of what he needed to know. He set his hand flat on the rifle rack. He turned from the rack. He walked to the counter. He stopped beside Gerald Mack. He looked at the medal in the open box. He looked at Howard Dills. He said, before Howard could reach for it, "What's the story on that medal?" Howard looked at him. Howard had not recognized him. Howard looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the man beside him. Gerald said, "It's mine. I'm selling it." Eastwood looked at the citation ribbon. He looked at Gerald. He said, "What branch?" Gerald said, "Army, 25th Infantry, 2 tours." Eastwood nodded once. He said, "Where?" Gerald said, "Suchi." Eastwood looked at the counter. He was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when something lands in him that he was not prepared for. He said, "How much is he giving you?" Gerald said, "40. Eastwood said, "Don't sell it." Gerald looked at him. He didn't know who this was. He saw a lean, older man in a work jacket who had been looking at hunting rifles. He said, "Mister, I need the $40. Eastwood said, I know. Don't sell it anyway. Have you ever had a stranger say 4 words to you that stopped the room completely? Not because the words were loud, because they were certain. The way a man says a thing when he has already decided and is just waiting for you to catch up. Gerald Mack stood at that counter for a moment without speaking. Howard Dills stood on the other side without speaking. The shop was quiet enough that you could hear the traffic on Spring Street through the plate glass. Then Eastwood reached into his jacket pocket. He brought out a plain leather wallet. He opened it on the counter. He counted out 4 $20 bills and set them in a row on the glass beside the open velvet box. He pushed them toward Howard. He said, "That's $80. I'm buying what he was going to sell you." Then he turned to Gerald. He said, "Close the box." Gerald did not move. Eastwood said it again, quieter. "Close the box." Gerald reached out slowly and folded the velvet lid down over the metal and the ribbon. He picked it up. He put it back in his coat pocket. Eastwood picked up the 4 20s from the counter and held them out to Gerald. He said, "The metal is worth more than either of us can put on a counter. This is for the hearing aid." Gerald looked at the money. He looked at the man. His jaw was tight. He said, "I don't take charity." Eastwood said, "It's not charity. It's what the VA should have covered." He held the money out and did not move. Gerald stood with the velvet box in his pocket and his hands at his sides, and he looked at the money for a long time. Then he took it. He did not say thank you right away. He looked at the floor. Then he looked up. He said, "Who are you?" Eastwood told him his name. Gerald looked at him. He said, "The actor?" Eastwood said yes. Gerald said, "I'll be damned." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Why?" Eastwood said, "Because $40 is not the right number for what you did. That's all." He put his wallet back in his jacket. He nodded at Howard Dills. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He turned back. He said, "Is there a coffee shop near here?" Gerald said, "Carlotta's, 2 blocks east." Eastwood said, "I'll buy the coffee if you've got 20 minutes. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I've got 20 minutes. They sat at a corner table at Carlotta's diner for 45 minutes. Gerald had a coffee. Eastwood had a coffee and a piece of pie he didn't finish. Nobody in the diner recognized Eastwood. He still had the wool cap on and the unshaved face and the canvas jacket, and he sat with his back slightly angled and his voice low, the way a man sits when he does not want to be a disturbance. He asked Gerald where he had served. Gerald told him. He asked about Cu Chi. Gerald told him about the tunnels and the heat and the particular quality of the silence before something happened that could not be taken back. He did not tell Eastwood what the Bronze Star was for. Eastwood did not ask. There are things men do not ask other men about, and that is one of them. He asked about Sandra and the children. Gerald told him about the boy who wanted to play baseball and the girl who was already reading 2 grades above her level. He told him about the house on the east side with the yard. He told him about the construction work and the dust in his boots. He did not tell him about the $12 in the checking account. He did not need to. Eastwood had been doing the math since the pawn shop. When they were done with the coffee, Eastwood put money on the table. He stood up. He put on his hat. He said, "The hearing on the left side. How long has it been bad?" Gerald said, "Since '67. Eastwood said, "There's a specialist in San Luis Obispo. He has a name on the door and a receptionist who makes it look expensive. He is not as expensive as he looks." He wrote a name on a paper napkin and slid it across the table. He said, "Tell him I sent you. He knows what veterans need, and he doesn't make them wait 3 months to find out he can help." He stood up from the table. He said, "Don't sell the medal, Gerald. Not for a hearing aid, not for a house payment, not for anything. Your kids are going to want to see it someday. Your grandkids are going to want to know what their grandfather did in Cu Chi in 1967. Don't let $40 be the reason they can't." Gerald picked up the napkin with the name on it. He folded it once and put it in his coat pocket beside the velvet box. He stood up. He put out his hand. Eastwood shook it once, hard. Then he walked out of Carlotta's and got into his truck and drove south on 101 toward Carmel, and no one saw him leave. Gerald Mack went to the specialist in San Luis Obispo the following week. He gave the receptionist the name Eastwood had written on the napkin. The receptionist looked at it. She made a phone call to the back office. She came back to the desk. She told Gerald the doctor would see him the same afternoon. The examination took an hour. The fitting for a new hearing aid took another 40 minutes. When Gerald asked the receptionist at the end of it what he owed, she looked at her ledger. She looked at Gerald. She said the account had been settled. Gerald said he didn't understand. She said it had been settled in full that morning by phone before he arrived. She said there was nothing else he owed today or going forward for the maintenance of the device. Gerald stood at the counter with his coat and his hat and his hands at his sides, and he did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Who settled it?" The receptionist said she wasn't able to say. Gerald said he understood. He put on his hat. He walked out. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a while before he started the engine. He did not tell Sandra where the hearing aid had come from. He told her the VA had come through. He was not proud of the half-truth. He carried it quietly. Sandra did not press him. She was glad he could hear. The children were glad he could hear. The boy, who was 7, noticed immediately that his father turned his head differently at the dinner table. He asked why. Gerald said the doctor had fixed something. The boy nodded and went back to his dinner. Children accept the repair of their fathers without needing the full accounting. They know what matters. What matters is that the thing is fixed. The velvet box went back to the shelf in the bedroom closet. Gerald opened it once more the following Christmas, on a Sunday morning before the children were awake. He looked at it the way you look at something that came very close to being lost. Then he closed it. He put it back. He did not look at it again for 11 years. Gerald Mack found steadier work in 1978 when a construction firm in San Luis Obispo took him on full-time. He had the good left ear by then. He heard the instructions. He did not miss things. He worked his way to foreman by 1981. He bought the house on the east side from the landlord in 1983 when the landlord decided he was done with property and Gerald had saved enough for the down payment. He planted a garden in the yard his son had run in as a boy. He grew tomatoes and peppers and one fig tree that took 3 years to produce anything worth keeping. Sandra said it was too much trouble. Gerald said a thing that takes 3 years to be worth keeping is the best kind of thing. She let him keep it. He never tried to contact Clint Eastwood. He did not write a letter. He did not seek him out at a premiere or a public appearance. He thought about it once, in the early 80s, when one of Eastwood's pictures was playing at the theater in Paso Robles, and Gerald took the family to see it. He sat in the dark and watched the screen, and thought about a corner table at Carlotta's diner, and a paper napkin folded once, and a handshake. He thought about whether he owed the man something more than the handshake. He decided he did not. The man had not wanted something in return. A man who does not want something in return does not need a letter. He needs to be left the way he left himself, which is alone and quiet and driving south on 101. The boy, whose name was Thomas, joined the Navy in 1989. He served 6 years. He came home with his own discipline and his own quiet, and a preference for keeping his back to the wall in rooms that surprised Sandra because she had seen it before. She did not mention it. She fed him. She let him sleep. She let him find his own way back. Thomas married in 1997. He had 2 children of his own. In 2001, Gerald gave Thomas the velvet box. He sat him down at the kitchen table and put the box on the wood between them and told him what it was and where it came from. He told him about Ku Chi and the 25th Infantry and the morning in 1967 that he still moved to the back room with the door closed. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Gerald was done, Thomas opened the box. He looked at the metal for a long time. Then he looked at his father. He said, "Pop, you almost sold this for $40? Gerald said, "Yes." He said, "What stopped you?" Gerald thought about it. He said, "A man in a wool cap who was looking at hunting rifles." Thomas said, "Who was he?" Gerald said his name. Thomas looked at him. He said, "The actor?" Gerald said yes. Thomas shook his head slowly. He looked at the metal again. He closed the box. He said, "Pop, I want you to keep it." Gerald said it was Thomas's now. Thomas said, "No." He said, "Keep it until you don't need it anymore. And then I'll keep it until I don't need it anymore. And then your grandchildren will keep it. And none of us are going to put it on a counter." Gerald looked at his son for a moment. Then he nodded. He took the box back. He put it in his coat pocket, the same coat pocket it had ridden in on a Tuesday in November 1977, and he carried it home. Some men understand the weight of a thing only after they have come close to putting it down. Gerald Mack had come within a handshake of $40 and an empty shelf. What stopped it was a stranger with a wool cap and a canvas jacket, and $80 on a glass counter, and 4 words said quietly in a pawn shop in Paso Robles. "Don't sell it anyway." That is all it took. 4 words and the certainty behind them. The kind of certainty a man carries when he has thought, at some point in his life, about what it costs to put down something you cannot pick back up. Clint Eastwood had thought about that. You could hear it in the 4 words. He knew exactly what it cost. He had been paying attention his whole life to what things were worth and what they were not worth, and the difference between the two. $40 was not the right number. He said so. He walked out of a pawn shop in Paso Robles and drove south on 101, and never mentioned it to anyone, and never looked for thanks, and never needed the story to travel. But the story traveled anyway, because that is what true things do. They travel on their own. They find the people who need them. They arrive when the math has stopped working and the velvet box is on the counter, and the man behind the counter is saying $40, and someone 3 feet away is still paying attention. That was the kind of man Clint Eastwood was, and unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, do me a favor. Pass it on. Share it with a veteran in your life, with the father who came home quiet, with the grandfather who never talked about what he did, but kept a small box on a shelf in the back of the closet. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.